Okay, here we go. It's recording. Hi everyone. Welcome to Histories in at Play, debates on historical game studies. This is an online symposium co-organized by DIGRA Italia, Roma Tre University, and the Ludus Historical Game Studies Network. My name is Paolo Ruffino. I'm the chair of DIGRA Italia, and I must say that I'm quite this is quite a significant event for all of us. This moment, this event, this symposium was supposed to be an in real life conference that was supposed to take place in spring earlier this year. And then, of course, we had to cancel all of that for obvious reasons. We are still hoping to continue to use this event as a starting point to organize a bigger conference next year in 2021. But of course, any planning at this stage, it's impossible. So we'll have to see about that. But thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I would like to thank, first of all, the members of the organizing committee for their perseverance in keeping on with the plan for this event. Lorena Rao, who is also going to be one of the speakers tomorrow, Valerio Cianfrocca, Valerio Tinalli, Francesco Liva, and also the members of the DIGRA Italia team. We have Marco Benoit Carbone, who will be moderating tomorrow, and all the others who have provided their feedback throughout the organization of this event. Riccardo Fassone, who is here with us today, Ilaria Mariani, Alan Mattiassi, Manuel Maximilian Riolo, and Enrico Gandolfi. There might be some of the others today, but I'm not sure if I'm seeing everyone. The participants and speakers for these two events are Andrew Elliott from the University of Lincoln, Souvik Mukherjee from the Presidency University of Kolkata in India, Esther Wright from Cardiff University, and tomorrow we're going to have Stefano Caselli from the University of Malta, Robert Oughton from University of Winchester, and Lorena Rao is currently an independent researcher and journalist. So for this event, we have been planning I'm not sure how usual or unusual it is in these very strange times, but perhaps a different way of organizing a conference or an academic event. So we have asked the participants to share videos of their presentations in advance, and we have uploaded them online. So we have asked all the participants to watch the videos of their talks before joining the event. And that's because we thought that the most interesting part of an online conversation is the Q&A is more than listening to a presentation. So I hope you had the time to watch the videos. I've copied in the chat a link to the YouTube page organized, put online by the Ludus Games Network, Research Network. So if at any moment, if you want, you can, of course, go back there and have a look, or access the abstracts on the DIGRA Italia website. There's a few rules, let's say, for the event. Please, microphones off unless you're not speaking, of course. The use of camera is optional. Of course, it's if you want to show your face, is better. Of course, it's much better for the conversation, but that's absolutely not necessary. If you want to ask a question, feel free to write in the chat or to raise up your hand. I will keep track of the order of requests, and I will moderate the event today. So I will give you time to ask your questions. We'll try to stay in between 25, 30 minutes max for each speaker for the questions. I mean, we'll see how the conversation goes. We are not too much restricted with time, but just to kind of give us a time frame. So is there any question actually so far? Is everything okay? Okay, yeah, can you all hear me? Is everything going fine so far? Good. All right then, with no further ado, and I'm still allowing some guests to join us at the moment. Welcome everyone. So with no further ado, I would like to start with the first, oh no, actually, sorry. I believe we have a video from the Ludus network that you guys would like to show. This is a new research network that started not long ago. So I would like to leave the stage, so to speak, to Valerio, Francesco, Lorena, who wants to talk here.
Okay, we are very glad to be the organizer of this conference, of course, alongside DIGRA Italia and Roma Tre University. And we just like to show you a short video in order to introduce the conference, today's conference. So welcome everyone, and enjoy the conference and enjoy the video.
Buongiorno a tutti, siamo Valerio Tinalli
e Valerio Cianfrocca,
due dei 4 studiosi che hanno fondato il gruppo di ricerca Ludus. Gli altri 2 creatori del gruppo sono Francesco Oliva e Lorena Rao. Ludus sta per letture dell'uso digitale nell'universo storico. In breve, ci occupiamo della rappresentazione della storia nel medium culturale dei videogiochi.
I videogiochi costituiscono un prodotto culturale divenuto di massa e con il nostro lavoro intendiamo individuare quale narrazione si produce da questa sovrastruttura ideologica e perché certi modelli vengono perpetuati. Insomma, vogliamo analizzare la percezione del passato a partire da un fenomeno culturale pop.
Il convegno Histories in Play, Debates on Historical Game Studies si terrà il 5 e il 6 novembre dalle 17 alle 19, ora italiana, e verterà proprio su questi temi. È possibile una rappresentazione anche educativa e costruttiva della storia nel videogioco? Noi pensiamo di sì, anzi, l'obiettivo finale dei giochi storici, secondo noi, dovrebbe essere quello di sensibilizzare il pubblico sui grandi temi della storia.
A questo convegno parteciperanno professori e studiosi di spessore internazionale e ciascuno dei quali tratterà un tema specifico sulla rappresentazione della storia nel mondo videoludico.
Vogliamo ringraziare il Master in Comunicazione Storica dell'Università di Roma Tre e DIGRA Italia per averci aiutato nell'organizzazione di questo convegno, senza i quali non si sarebbe tenuto.
Detto ciò, vi salutiamo e vi auguriamo di vedervi numerosi su Histories in Play.
Good morning everyone, I am Valerio Tinalli.
And I'm Valerio Cianfrocca.
We are 2 of the 4 co-founders of Ludus Research Group. We have built this team during last summer alongside Lorena Rao and Francesco Oliva.
The goal of Ludus is to analyze video games as a medium. We want to explore the connections between video games, historical facts, and historiography.
Historians are often thought of as annoying erudites who criticize every cultural production related to their field of research. We want to change this stereotype.
We know as well that every historical narrative has a specific purpose and is based on specific prejudices.
We want to identify the narratives these ideological superstructure produce, and we also want to investigate potential patterns behind these topics.
Our goal is to analyze the common notion of past by focusing on a contemporary cultural product, such as video games.
We will examine in depth these topics on November the 5th and November the 6th during the online conference Histories in Play, Debates on Historical Game Studies.
The symposium is organized in partnership with the Master School in Historical Communication of Roma Tre University and DIGRA Italia.
In this conference, we will outline the state of the art of historical game studies. Several international researchers will join us.
Andrew Elliott from Lincoln University, UK, Esther Wright from Cardiff University, and Rob Houghton from Winchester University.
Stefano Caselli from Malta University, Souvik Mukherjee from Kolkata University, and Lorena Rao, who is a member of Ludus and writes about video games and historical game studies.
We're looking forward to see you at the symposium.
Okay,
thank you for the introduction and the time of our introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerio. Thank you to Valerio, Francesco, Lorena, and everyone in at Ludus. Actually, I would like also to thank Donatella Montemurno from Roma Tre, has been extremely helpful in organizing the real life conference that never happened. So she's put a lot of effort into something that never really materialized. But she has been great. All right, so one more thing, actually, I almost forgot to say, if you want to ask your questions in Italian, feel free to do so and we will translate them for you. Okay, so don't worry about that. All right, so I would like to introduce the first presenter for today, who actually might be able to take your questions in Italian because he's fluent in Italian as well, and that's Andrew Elliott, senior lecturer at the University of Lincoln, who contributed with a talk on the historiographical principles of video games. Hi, Andrew. Thank you very much for your participation, for sending out your video. So I would like to introduce you by asking you to briefly summarize your contribution for those of us who maybe watched the video a few days ago, want to kind of refresh the main argument, the main topic of your intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, Paolo. Can everyone hear me just to check the audio is working? Excellent. Okay, it's very strange to see a lot of nodding heads here. I thought that actually uploading your talk online would make me feel considerably less nervous than actually presenting. As the first presenter, I can confirm it doesn't. But thank you, Paolo, and thank you, DIGRA Italia, and to the Ludus group for inviting me. I feel immensely honored. I still feel something of an imposter in games, and that's, I think, leading me straight into what I'm talking about. I'm very interested in the way that media generally kind of interprets the past, the ways in which the interpretation of history through media forms is inevitably not about the past as a single aspect, but as about the present and about who we think we are. Now, when I was trying to put together some thoughts that I thought could simplify the presentation that appears on YouTube, I've spent the entire day, like probably most of the world, on Twitter, refreshing a particular set of results and watching someone, and it was whilst refreshing those results and watching a particular candidate who's famous for his loose relationship with history in that election, twisting the past in order to rewrite the history of something that the world has been watching for a few days. And it suddenly felt like the student who hasn't done his homework, who realizes, actually, I can kind of wing my way through this, because it suddenly realized here again is exactly the same problem we're seeing. So my question was about the historiographic potential of video games. And I realize I make myself sound really, really old by insisting on calling them video games. It's simply a habit. I do mean games or digital games or whatever it is that you would want me to call them to not hate me. But I am really interested in the power of games at constructing that reality by constructing the past. Watching the videos today, I was really, really interested to see that Esther is also grappling with some of the similar questions about the paratexts. And when she's talking about paratexts, your questions about simplifying. And I thought this question of simplifying is a similar question, because the question of simplifying history is a question of squeezing, I think you called it squeezing hegemony into the actual text through kind of both the paratext and the text themselves. And of course, that raises the question about who gets to do that simplifying, who gets to squeeze that hegemony in there. The question of hegemony also through the work of Gramsci informed Souvik's really interesting and fascinating talk on playing kind of the post-colonial. The question, of course, about the subaltern and who gets to speak. And so my questions then really are all about what games do, and I find us at a really interesting moment. And I was really fascinated by the two Valerias. I don't know how to pluralize that. Valeri, I guess. The introduction, which talks about the framing of the past as an act of ownership, as an act of presentation, and as an act of a curious cultural power. So I guess all I have are questions. I have no answers. I see a screen of 40 people who can give me really interesting answers. So that's kind of where I was interested in approaching the question from, I guess.
Thank you, Andrew. I might have a question, just taking advantage of my position as moderator, just to ask the first question, but I can see already some questions appearing on the chat. So you presented this. Let's say that we decided to put your presentation first because we believe and we agree that your talk provides an excellent overview of the current debates in the field. And you do so by providing 6 different areas of research. And among all these 6 areas, I think one of the aspects that emerges, particularly in the third one, actually, in the number 3, is this focus on the personalized histories, on rewriting histories, on making history your own, which is, of course, brings with it questions on power, of legitimacy, hegemony, and so on. And while I was listening to your talk, I was also wondering, there has been for a long time a discussion in game studies about the technical possibilities of the medium of the video game, which has been seen for a long time as this sort of ultimate postmodernist tool that allows everyone to write their own stories, their own narratives, to choose your own adventure. And I was wondering, which is at the same time, of course, connected to the technical affordances of video games, but also to a sort of technical imaginary that surrounds interactive media. So I was wondering to what extent what you're talking about connects with this imagination and fascination about video games.
Yes, I thought your question was going in a different way, and I had a really clever answer ready to say, is it only about video games and the possibilities of video games? Is this a new form? Because I know that it's really, really exciting. Certainly looking at games, at the kind of the affordances, at the kind of the new digital horizon that those games put together. When you're asking about the technical imaginary, I mean, part of me feels like that's been something that has always been the case with any form of historiography. If you think about coming right there back to Thucydides, right, there is an element of a kind of historical imaginary that is taking place that is also intimately and inextricably intertwined with the technology that is being used to put forward that kind of imagination. So at the very, very roots of historiography, we're finding a kind of a relationship between let's say a new technological form that allows for a new kind of inquiry. My question, or the thing that I find fascinating about games in particular, is the participatory dimension. So this is why you mentioned number 3, and I actually had to look up my own list. Number 3 was Tom Appley's modding, I think. Is that what you were referring to? And I think that question of the modding of this kind of very, very active player, right, is really, really interesting. Partly because the game studies folks, and I know that Esther will be able to talk much better than me about kind of the active player, but the games folks, you guys, it seems really obvious to you that the player would be some kind of active creator of a past, an active kind of almost a curator of pastness. Whereas this is quite a revelation, and this is what I was trying to put forward in my argument. This is quite a revelation that has actually helped me looking at other disciplines, and I think helped looking at the kind of the mediation of history as a whole, because it's something that doesn't seem immediately obvious for, let's say, a filmmaker, who for 100 years have been piecing together the past, but hiding the historiography as a process that takes place before the ultimate presentation of the film to an audience. Whereas the games and the modders, and I knew nothing about modders until I read Tom's piece about modding, and you've seen that the modders are tweaking and playing at the fringes of history and making it into a fundamentally participatory project. That to me seems fascinating, and it seems to me a way of forcing us to confront the constructed nature of history, that all history is in some sense constructed. And so that sort of brings front and center the questions of power and hegemony that you're sort of dealing with, because we can't hide behind the fact that Cecil B. DeMille is a successful filmmaker, or that Ridley Scott is a successful filmmaker with a studio behind him. We actually have to confront ourselves with the fact that a game is always making us piece together history, and I thought that was a really interesting angle.
Thank you, Andrew. All right, so we are ready to take other questions. I can see that Leila has a question in the chat. So she's asking if you are familiar with a game called Old World, and her question is, while a video game can be a great way to expose players to history, there are also many restrictions that make a game unplayable if one is to stick with just the historically accurate narrative. So what is the tool, in your opinion, or the way to mechanize history in a way that could be playable and fun while also preserving an historical value?
Mechanize history. I mean, that seems like an excellent title for an article in itself, Mechanizing History. And I'd actually love to hear Leila's ideas about that. What is the tool that would mechanize history in a way that makes it, I mean, I guess if I can kind of sidestep that in some kind of intellectual jujitsu here, the question actually at the heart of that question is a question about what is games, right? Which, you know, here we go, game studies 101, you know, suits in Keiwa and so on. But the idea of some kind of tool that allows us to play history, video game developer, okay. Right, that does make sense actually as a developer, because thinking in terms of the tools that would allow you to kind of mechanize history, I'm not sure actually, because if you think about the history as a discipline, all history as a discipline is in one way or another teaching us to mechanize history, how to assess a primary source as in terms of its, you know, reliability, how to identify secondary sources, how to piece together those narratives in one kind of role or another. In some ways, that is all mechanized. What is absolutely fascinating are those moments where people make the leaps, or those moments where we recognize the influence that each individual historian has over this history she tells. So, I mean, as a medievalist, my kind of real fascination was learning all this kind of medieval history, and you learn about the correct people in the correct kind of order and so on. And then I read Cantor, okay, 1990 book, you know, about how history is put together, and thinking this is something completely mind-blowing, right? Norman Cantor's book, this kind of talks about how the historians' lives themselves and their own ideological perspectives and practices fundamentally change the past that they're telling. And so to me, that it wasn't the mechanization, it was the exception to the mechanization that allowed the real leaps forward. And I've seen kind of similar things in game studies and historical game studies. It's not necessarily the processes that are embedded within the games, it's the processes that make you stop and think in a slightly different way. And Souvik's been talking about this in terms of Age of Empires. You know, that moment, the shock of recognition, but also recognition from a different perspective, allows you to reveal the ideological underpinnings beneath it. And to me, that kind of it's the anti-mechanized tool that I was really fascinated by.
Thank you, Andrew. All right, we can take more questions from the audience.
Actually, I have a question that came to my mind pretty now. And there is some kind of differences between kind of historical games about FPS, strategics, GDR, or someone else, through the message that that these games could bring to audience. Messages that could be positives or negative, messages of some kind.
Yeah, so your question is what kind of message that is, or
is if there is some kind of differences between types of video games, if the one FPS is different from a GDR or a FPS or someone else.
I mean, I guess we're kind of we really risk entering the realm of media effects if we're not very careful on that kind of respect. And you know, as someone who now teaches in media, a lot of my life is spent, you know, defending media from the charge that games make you violent, that violent films make you, you know, stab people. I have a colleague who just, if you even mention that, he will run up and punch you in the throat for even suggesting that this will happen. And he has this argument about the only medium that can actually have any kind of effect, universal effect on the audience, is the weather forecast that might make you bring an umbrella. But actually, speaking to DIGRA Italia, I mean, you know, you're probably not quite as fixated on the weather as we are in the UK. And so maybe that analogy doesn't even work as well. I mean, the problem with thinking about the genres having a different effect on the audience is also there I've got to do two things. One, I've got to kind of universalize a genre, and two, I've got to universalize the audience, right? And to me, that's a problem. I mean, I'm illustrating it here because I've got what I've got to do some very public maths here. 25 squares. I need Rob when I'm doing maths. And they've got 25 squares of different kind of reactions that are kind of all completely different. Now, that may be just a delay in the speech, or that may be just, you know, that every person is unique. And of course, the whole point is that everyone playing so any kind of medium and consuming any kind of medium is inevitably going to have a completely different reaction to the person in the square next to them. So in some sense, I would say absolutely not. But what I have argued is the reverse. There are certain things that, to borrow Adam Chapman's term, afford a different reaction or encourage a different kind of process that I've, you know, I stood behind, and it always sounds really creepy and horrible when I say so. I stood behind some students and watched them play for about 2 hours, right? And just watched what they were doing. And it was absolutely fascinating. I mean, the problem I have is I'm not particularly good at gaming. I'm fascinated by it, but I'm really not very good at it. So I quite like to watch other people doing it and ask them what decisions they've made. Now, I had 5 students all playing the same game and all making different judgments and different decisions. Sometimes those 5 different judgments were for the same reason. Sometimes, you know, 5 different reasons led to the same judgment. But it was fascinating that the games that they were playing when we switched from a strategy to an FPS encouraged different kinds of processes. You know, one might be encouraging thinking slightly further ahead or strategic. The other one might be a little more visceral and immediate. I would hate to universalize on that level in terms of the historiographical potential of games. But I do think that there might be some value in studying audiences and how they react to specific genres. That's a very long way of not answering your question, Valerio. I'm completely aware.
Yes, of course. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have a few questions from the chat. One from William. Thank you for the excellent presentation, Andrew. So William says, your presentation connects with other papers and describes a movement away from questions of accuracy and towards a model that includes, for instance, Farmville-style games, which means exploring uses of history in games in all forms rather than focusing on worthy historical games. And this model includes a focus on the developer historian. So my question, is there a role for historian developers, meaning historians making games that add something to the industry, even as historians, historical game studies 2.0, as you have described it, reject the notion of monolithic historical worth in games in terms of accuracy?
Excellent question, thank you. Wow, yeah, well, I hope so, is the obvious answer. I really hope there is a role for the developer historian. I can see that Ulva is decidedly looking away from the camera right now because she knows that I'm going to point to her doctoral thesis that was extraordinary and exactly plays on this idea of the developer historian and what they can offer. Certainly, I absolutely hope so. I think developers are doing something slightly different because, as Rob's pointed out in several unofficial publications, developers are very often nerds and historians are very often nerds. And that Venn diagram has a really interesting crossover, the historian-developer kind of nerd nexus, let's call it that. In that it's doing something slightly different, because that first point I made about the playability and the giant participatory project of games, that's what I find fascinating. And so when we have someone who has an active interest in games, as Ulva discovered when she talks to people who are reading history in their spare time, that's their passion, their hobby, and then making, and I don't want to misrepresent you, Ulva, so I don't know if there's a possibility of allowing her to speak, but then making something that is kind of playing out that kind of fascination, which is then played by people who are equally fascinated by it, who get to piece together their own argument about history. I find that fascinating. As a kid who grew up with kind of choose your own adventure, that drawing into a medium that prevents you from being passive, this to me seems the real promise of where I see game studies or historical game studies going in the future. I think we absolutely need to study more developers, and Tara and Ulva have persuaded me absolutely of that. And we also need to study the players a great deal more to avoid people like me saying generalizations like I just have, because we desperately need that kind of empirical data about what audiences are doing and how they're engaging. That to me is the really exciting area, looking at both of those two, because we've done a lot of the big name AAA game kind of media. We've done a lot of the epic films. We've done a lot of the big TV studios and thousands of studies of the BBC. But now we need to be looking at who's watching and who's making. I think that's the exciting part.
Great, thank you, Andrew. So Marco has a question, and then we have another one from Matteo from the chat. So I will let Marco ask his question.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for the excellent presentation. I very much enjoyed it. I want to follow on your point about personalized histories, which was prompted by Paolo's question before, and the fact that you said new forms of inquiry are being made possible by games. It's not, of course, just your idea, but rather one of the major currents. I think we would agree that are characterizing HGS right now. So as a media scholar, I've got this concern about a theoretical risk of media essentialism. That's my perspective. So if you ask any media scholar, they will tell you that their medium is different or it's special. And so are we sure that historical counter-narrative explored by games really make them different ideologically just because they are interactive? I mean, you mentioned modders, right? And so modders, of course, they are working at the fringes of dominant canons and histories, but they do that just like independent filmmakers. So I think that there might be the risk there. I'm just, I'm asking myself and you and the rest of the audience, there's a forced logical passage there that even though a game as a simulation may be, non-linear, doesn't mean it's not enclosed within an ideology and the range of possibilities which have already been foreclosed. So that's about thinking not just about geographies or history in the media, but about the history and geographies of media, which is a point which was remarked by Souvik in their paper. Which leads me to a second nested question, if I may be pardoned but for checking that. So speaking of being imposters, I'm not speaking like an historian, which I'm not, but rather somebody who is mainly concerned with a sociology of culture in a way. So academics as a professional category and also academic disciplines are very much part of my concerns. So you discussed the emergence of the HGS, and I wanted to ask you what you think about contextualizing that within the political situation of higher education. I'm speaking for the United Kingdom, of course, which I know probably relatively better than Italy, where we've had departments of history shutting down as recently as in January, I think, because the students weren't really interested. So are we looking at a situation where traditional approaches are turning to video games to survive? Is there a chance that with the idea of exceptionalism of games, because they're interactive, each hand washes the other, so the historians get to make history, and I suspect games gain legitimacy. It's something which I wrote when I wrote about LA Noire, which is something that Esther wrote about, but unfortunately that was written in Italian in my case, so it went under the radar, but that's another decolonization problem. I guess. Well, not really colonization, but, you know, relative sphere of influence. So by saying that, of course, it would be far from a bad thing, but that leads me to suspect, I've got this suspect that the idea of personalized history may be part, in a way, of the ideology of participatory cultures that we live in, whereby ultimately we serve our own bubbles with all the political implications that comes from there. So thanks for listening to this very long question. Thanks in advance.
Thank you, Marco. It's also great to see you again. I haven't seen you since, I think, Liverpool about 5 years ago now, maybe longer. That's a really interesting question. I think it's one that I'm sure Souvik and Esther will want to pick up on possibly too, and it'll probably spill over into tomorrow. I do actually see possibly, I'll try and keep a short answer. I do actually see a similarity in both of the questions in the structure of the university system, and not only in the UK university system, which anyone who works in it knows is fundamentally flawed. You know, we have many flaws, and there is a problem. I guess part of the problem is that there is an inherent tendency to curtain off a discipline, to see it as under threat, and therefore to over stress the importance of that discipline, which is, I sort of felt that was kind of what you were suggesting in the beginning of your question, which means that, you know, it's tempting to say that only video games can encourage this kind of interactivity, and I get really mad when people say that, because you're not a passive spectator in the cinema, you're not a passive audience of television. And the other thing is that very often we do forget that an audience or a player is never just a player. They are always audiences of other media. They are always audiences of other structural forms of consuming the past. And, you know, Rosenzweig and Fell in 1998 conducted that very famous, slightly boring, but very famous survey of 3,000 people and how they'd engage with the past. And it was fascinating. They talked about, have you looked at a photograph with family? Which, you know, you try and explain that to my students nowadays who say, like, what's a photograph? Well, okay. But you know, it's fascinating is the recognition that we're always parts of multiple audiences at any moment, even when we are, you know, theoretically just playing. And I think there's a similar thing with the industry as well that's taking place there, that actually we are all always interdisciplinary, and we have to be. So, you know, you were sort of feeling defensive when you say you're a sociologist. I mean, crikey, I'd love to have a sociologist on my team, you know. And I have no money, I should say. And I remember, you know, graduating from my PhD in 2009, and you may remember there was a bit of an economic problem. And so, of course, you know, the question is, I remember someone at the beginning of my PhD, you know, they walked me out to the fields of the future and said, this is all in a few years going to be interdisciplinary, right? And then you get to graduate, you look at the job boards and it's like, are you going for history? Are you going for media? Are you going for, you know, and they're all disciplinary jobs. And so in some ways we live this fundamental fraudulent, but quite useful myth that actually somehow we are uniquely within one discipline and we have no interests in other disciplines. Once we actually allow that kind of freedom, then we insert new questions, and I promise to keep it short. So we'll just finish by saying the way that I'm thinking about it is something actually Souvik picked up on in his talk, which was fascinating point about Wolfgang Iser, right? You're the only person I've actually encountered who references Wolfgang Iser in the last sort of 50 years. But yeah, the implied consumer to me is fascinating because it's a way of bypassing individual media and a way of recognizing transmediality. And I've been playing around with very publicly the idea of historical capital as a kind of like Bourdieu's cultural capital, but historical capital, which is acquired from multiple places and spent in different ways. And the work I'm actually doing right now is inspired by imposter syndrome, and it's called Bad History. And it's a book that is deliberately very bad history to try and suggest that actually through bad history we can have good questions, and to try and push at the edges of those disciplines. So that's kind of where my feeling is, but I think that will spill over into other questions.
Thank you very much.
I'm quite conscious of time, actually, and there are many questions in the chat, but I'm afraid we are not able to take any more questions. Perhaps Matteo Lupetti, because you actually wrote this question quite early on. So we'll just bring this question to you, Andrew, but apologies for all the others. So the question is, I feel like there is an important difference between the effect of player agency on the in-game history told by the game itself and the action of a modder. We can play a video game to disrupt a hegemonic reading of history, but one, it doesn't usually happen. Two, it has no value if the game is not played in front of an audience, if it's not a performance. The people who can actually rework historical storytelling through video games are the authors themselves or the modders. And this rereading has value if it is shifting the power, the real agency of telling stories, giving new opportunities to people who usually cannot tell their own story. So in short, shouldn't we put a more important focus on who is telling and retelling history?
Yes. Yes, we should. I mean, that is partly my answer. Yeah, it's an absolutely important point. There is a fundamental question. It's like very often people will say nowadays with blogs and so on, anyone can reach an audience of thousands or whatever. And well, they can't. I have a blog like everyone else that I started and I got bored of and that no one ever read. I mean, not even my mother, that we've all tried these questions of fighting back, and we like to assume that there is the power of fighting back, or a question of wresting power from the producers and being able to retransmit it. But I do think there is something important there, that actually the word storytelling is so critical to that question, that it is about being able to shift someone else's question about the past, being able to maybe introduce a moment of doubt in someone's playing of the past. And this is something that Esther's done really well in thinking about paratexts, that, if you think about the way that the game is framed before you play it, affects the way that you're going to play it. And I appreciate I sound like I'm falling victim to my own media effects theory, and I'm not, but it is shaping and framing that kind of entry point. Now, if you as a modder can change the way that you approach one thing, and you're going to be part of other groups, then that must have a knock-on effect somehow. I don't know how, and I cannot prove it, but it must, to me, there must be some power in the fact that if you're interested in history of video games, you set up a society called Ludus, and you find other people, and you will shape a few other people's way of approaching the past. And to me, there is power in that. There is something different and something powerful. But yes, I mean, I'm finding it hard to answer because it's a very good question, and I agree. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the answers are, but I agree that that's a really important question. That's a total cop out, and I apologize, but I just think it is important.
All right, thank you, Andrew. And again, apologies for all the others who are asking questions, but of course, we will copy the chat at the end of this, and we'll allow, you can, of course, I guess, get in touch with Andrew if you want to continue the conversation. So we were planning to have a 5 minutes break, but this might not be possible if we want to stick with the schedule. So I suggest, should we take maybe just 2 minutes, or 2 minutes break, no more than that. So we will be back again at let's say 51, 52 with Souvik Mukherjee with his talk, Truly an Age of Empires, Coded Colonialism and Subaltern Histories in Video Games. All right, I'll see you soon. So I'm not sure if I cannot see anyone anymore as everyone left. Okay, you're still there. So let's see if I'm not sure if the others are still away. It might be worth waiting another minute just to allow everyone to come back.
Agree with that. I just wanted to say I'm really, I was delighted to see what's, is a relatively highly diverse lineup of speakers. And also that, in spite of us giving into English as a dominant language of research, I like that the conference schedule was in Central European summertime, but I hope that was not mistaken as a sort of nostalgic way to reappraise the Roman Empire or something, as we already got empires worn off in a way, as we speak, actually. Okay.
The next conference will be in Latin. Well, Ludus is Latin word. Here you go.
They could translate for all the others.
If we need a translator for the. Yeah.
Of course. Ludus stands for game, simply, in Latin, and there is a very interesting game of words, because we also speak about video games. So there is the game about this word.
All right, shall we start? I mean, I'm thinking we might not be able. We need to, finish at least by 6 p.m. Roman time, which is 7 p.m. Italian time. All right. So the next speaker for today is Souvik Mukherjee, assistant professor at President's University in Kolkata, India. Souvik, I believe it's the time zone actually for you is not very comfortable. So thank you for agreeing to participate, and despite the late time in where you are now. So as with Andrew, I would like you to briefly summarize the main argument of your presentation. The title is Truly an Age of Empires, Coded Colonialism and Subaltern Histories in Video Games, and then we will open the stage for the questions. Thank you.
So thanks a lot, Paolo, for introducing me. It is indeed 10:30 p.m. here, and well, I'm very grateful that I could come. I could be part of this. Very grateful to the University of Roma Tre and the Ludus network and DIGRA Italia. So again, what I try to explore in my presentation is this question about the historiographic lens, which is something that Andrew talks about, the historiographic lens that we see, things through in video games. And, I'm trying to look at these many games, the strategy games, which have a colonial empire basis behind, in their names and in the gameplay, Age of Empires, Empire Total Wars, and War, and what have you. And also other games which are not overtly imperialistic in their, at least in the way they're described, but like Lara Croft, Tomb Raider or Uncharted, which I've talked about in my presentation briefly. So I am interested in how games work in these very colonial terms when presenting history, often even inadvertently. Often they may not realize, or the developers or the way the game kind of algorithm is designed, it doesn't really, it might not be overtly kind of colonial. It might not understand. It might not, be aware that there is a colonial imperialistic kind of, thing behind it. But I argue that this is something that we need to explore, And my question is there colonial thinking in the very way the algorithmic coding of history in games is kind of to be perceived? And that also connects to this the point about mechanizing history, which I look at it in a different way. If we are talking about the history machine, and if we are talking about kind of how the code, is there a code kind of in which kind of history is presented, and is the code of the game also then tending to have a colonial bias? And if so, then of course, what are the ways in which we can actually challenge this way of reading history? And so there again, I think Esther's point about paratext, which is something I've also worked on earlier, is extremely interesting. And the whole idea of the multiplicity of play, what play can do in the representation of history, how play can totally change not totally, but how play can change the representation of history in the multiplicity, which I think has been addressed earlier in some of the questions. But I mean, my point is to start to think differently about how history is presented. And again, one fundamental question that I have to ask is, what about the voices of the that come from the margins and of the minor, the people who don't have archives, who don't, for example, Deepesh Chakraborty, the Indian historian, he says that there are many people who might not have recorded histories, but they have memories. So what about those? What about that really? That's kind of something that is, I think, is important. And of course, we know how the kind of bias and the importance of the Anglophone or Francophone or whatever, what have you, world. Marco just mentioned that an article in Italian obviously might not have made the kind of sort of might not have come into the prominence of discussions. But then again, this is what Walter Mignolo talks about as border thinking, as kind of as the need to kind of look at what is on the borders, look at what is on the margins, and then also to think of history as it is kind of perceived from the point of view of those who are not really allowed to speak in kind of like in the established historical terms. So that's what I'm looking at, and I'm looking at kind of games that kind of do this, and the games that kind of perpetuate a colonialist logic. And I'm kind of still thinking as to why this is happening. And I'm also kind of curious about what are the other ways of playing in which can represent the histories of those who are not represented. So I think that's kind of in a nutshell.
Thank you, Souvik. So, okay, we can take questions from the audience. I might have a question just to break the ice, so to speak. It was actually a curiosity. So when I was listening to your presentation, some of the AAA games that you mentioned, and bear in mind, I don't have like a perfect knowledge of all of them, but I kind of, I know pretty much their structure. But one thing that kind of was brought to my attention is that many of those games, such as Uncharted or Assassin's Creed, they not only have a specific understanding of what to take from other territories or predating and taking things and relics and so on from other places, but they also have a very defined understanding of the geography of the world. So usually the main character is traveling across different parts of the world, but only temporarily, and is always returning back to a safe home.
Yes.
It's very obvious, and of course, Lara Croft, she is always going back to her mansion in England, and Assassin's Creed, I believe it's the main narrative of the game is that the main character can use this sort of technologies to teleport or to move across time, but there is always a safe home. So I'm wondering if these colonialist perception of it is not also reflected in this imaginary of this sort of like tourist of time and space. You can travel in different places in different ages, doing what they want, and then always returning with going back home, essentially.
That's a fantastic question, Paolo, which is that, I mean, I want to address it by saying that with Lara Croft, it is a very clear colony and metropole situation. So Lara Croft starts in the metropole, goes to the colony, explores, gets relics, and then comes back, has adventures, obviously. Just like, I mean, I think I mentioned Ida Christina Jorgensen's work with Treasure Island, and also Thomas Mayakovsky, who compared this to historical boys' adventure stories like King Solomon's Mines or Treasure Island. So here is Alan Quatermain, who goes into the depths of Africa, which is charted like a woman's body, and he explores the body. It's kind of very exploitative and exploitative, and he takes over, finds different things, gets diamonds, gets whatever, and then goes back to London. Or similarly, like Jim Hawkins, and they go to the Treasure Island, they chart the course of the island. And a lot about this colonial enterprise is about seeing. Just like in Age of Empires, you put like those watchtowers. I still remember the watchtowers that whistle at you whenever you put them, and then you have this line of sight, and you kind of you overcome the fog of war. So it's about seeing and bringing. The eye brings things under control. But then the idea is that you can always go back to that safe haven of the metropole, as it were. And I want to add another aspect to it. I want to add the aspect of identity tourism to what you've just said. Lisa Nakamura talks about it. So you can actually go in the avatar of somebody else. You can actually walk into an identity of someone, and you don't just kind of traverse cartography and maps. You also traverse somebody else's identity. So let's say if let's say I colonize somebody, I can just walk into that person's shoes as Lara Croft and then get back. So that's also one more thing that is there to it. So, but the safety, of course, without safety, well, there is no security and kind of no steadiness that colonialism will always claim, right? So that's what.
Thank you.
I have a question, if there is no objections.
Yeah, sorry, may I ask you, is Ilva, does Ilva have a question, or was that a comment to Marco?
No, I have a question, but I think Leila was in front of me, actually.
Oh, sorry, Leila has a question too. Sorry,
Go ahead.
Right.
I don't
Order
mind.
is Leila, Ilva, and then Valerio. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, I thank you so much for this beautiful event that's taken place, and I do hope that my conference ends tomorrow and I'd be able to join again. I'm in Washington, D.C., so I'm really very far from the Roman Empire. I am a developer. We make historical games, and yes, it is very difficult to go in time and find the point of view of the minorities, right? Like write a historical game about Cleopatra. How did Cleopatra see things happen on her end? You know, like with everything happens, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony and Cicero saying, you know, talking crap about her. I'd love to make that game. But for the game we were making in the classical antiquity, it was very difficult with the 7 rulers, for example, to find the same amount of resources and information that is available about Greece and Rome that is equivalent in Babylonia and Assyria and Carthage. There's so little is known. And often what happens, and we are lucky, like for example, Soren, a co-founder, he studied history in Stanford. I am a huge fan of history. I studied journalism. We both write code and we both make historical games. So the knowledge is there in terms of education, and the passion is there. But when we come to present, for example, how it was from Hatshepsut's point of view, do we view it with a modern eye as a new challenge? Do we want to present slavery as a controversial issue that we are deeming in our game the way that we would deem it today in modern history do want to take aside all of these things, mechanizing history. I shared the talk, please feel free to watch it. It's just really barely goes into the depth of how much work was done to recreate a history and give it to the player. The challenge remains, though, the player will take that knowledge and do whatever they want. Like, they will alternate history. We are never able to create a game, at least so far with you know how games are. We're never able to create a game that happens exactly the way history wants it, because you are putting the player in charge. The question here is for historians or scholars of any different discipline that are present here is, how many of you really play historical games?
Well, I can answer for myself. I do play a lot of historical games, but then I think one response to that is that where you said that so my question is, how does history perceive itself? And when you say that, then my question is, whose history and what history? So that is my big question. For example, there is I'm not going to speak much of classical antiquity here, but I've focused on the game Oregon Trail, which is based on Francis Parkman's novel or journal rather. And Oregon Trail was an extremely popular pedagogical game. Many people in the USA played it when they were kids. And so I'm wearing a T-shirt which says "You have died of colonialism." This is a very famous scene in Oregon Trail. You've died of cholera. So what the Oregon Trail game kind of talks about as cholera, there's also kind of is also looked at in a different in a different kind of perspective as kind of also colonialism. Right, and I'm kind of like, which is why I've mentioned the When Rivers Were Trails games, which has been made by Elizabeth Laponzi in response to the Oregon Trail game. So then there are these other voices that we do not often kind of. It's the whole idea is of historiography. What kind of historiography are we kind of employing? If it is always the archive-based historiography, like I said, the people who don't have archives might still have memories. But if it's always the archive-based historiography, then I think there is a problem. There is, and the problem is not just with the machine code. The problem is with the code of history itself. There is an algorithm or code which is which is the spin I gave on your comment on mechanizing history and the history machine. So yeah.
Thank you. So we have a question now from Ilva. And then Valerio. I've also seen some other hands raised. We'll see if there is time, but I will let Ilva and Valerio ask their questions now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Souvik, very much for this interesting presentation and for always asking the most important of questions. I have a question that actually ties back a little bit to the previous question and also to Matteo Lupetti's question earlier about whether play and the act of playing is actually authorship. You know, when you play something, do you author history, so to speak? Very simplified way to put it. But anyway, it's about the notion of counterplay, because you mentioned in your presentation, I think very briefly, the notion of counterplay in connection to counterfactuals. Yes. And I find that developers more and more seem to go to great lengths actually to design native and inherent counterfactual scenarios and possibilities for the market specifically, that it's not just some emergent thing, it's something that's already in the game when you buy it. So what happens then to this notion of counterplay, in your opinion? I'm so curious to hear what you think, when the sort of the hegemonic narrative imposes itself on the non-hegemonic narrative, yes. If you see where I'm going with this question.
Yes. Shall I answer?
Yeah, of course. That was a question.
Yeah, brilliant. So I'm also going to link back to Leila's point earlier as well on what is considered history and what is considered kind of history that can be presented by the developers. And there is this, it's a very interesting point that you make. And I made my point about counterplay, referencing the work of Emil Hamar, and also counterfactuality, talking about Tom Apperly's work on this. But you see, counterfactuality can work in multiple ways. Now, Niall Ferguson, who is this big kind of champion of counterfactuality in studying history, Niall Ferguson's major case is that he thinks that if the British Empire survived, then it would be, so for me as a subject of a country that was formerly part of the British Empire, I don't want that counterfactuality. You see, I don't want the British Empire to come back and kind of, I don't know if any other people here want it, but I don't. But the thing is that counterfactuality can work in multiple different ways. And in my book, I have a kind of part, which is that the same logic is theirs. So if I have, let's say, the kingdom of Heishi conquering England, that is the same logic of colonialism that I might have for the reverse. So that is my problem with the algorithmic kind of notion of colonialism that is fed into the thinking of games, I think. So I think when we are thinking of gameplay and designing gameplay, perhaps a better idea, let's not say better, but perhaps another idea is to explore a different mechanic of gameplay rather than this. So that's what my point is. So, yeah.
Thank you. Valerio?
Yes, and speaking about that and your research, you have mentioned Empire Total War, and which is a game I know well.
No, me too.
And my question is, which is the situation of last strategic games with the aspect of your research? Because Empire Total War, for example, is the first game, first strategic games that includes some nation out of Europe, for example,
yes.
Marathon, Mughals on Iroquois in America, or
yes.
Other games, for example, Europa Universalis 4 on the Europa Universalis saga is
yes.
some games that includes all the nation in the world. So my question, in fact, is this: which is the situation of last games, strategic games about this aspect?
So I mean, I'm a diehard strategy games player, but ever since they made me head of department a while ago, I've not played games for like almost 1.5 years. But now the thing is that I'm kind of getting back into gameplay again, and I think. Well, I was the last one that I played was the Shogun, game again, which has America coming in, and obviously that's an imperialistic part there. Of course, it's the Japanese, the samurai code, but then the Americans come in and the American weapons come in. So I think it's still the same, really. I don't see a big difference. Now, I haven't played Total War Warhammer, which is a very different kind of a game, I think. I will play it sometime. But I think the logic is still there. And then again, Empire Total War, the Chinese, I forget the one that is based in China. Really, I've played a bit of it. Really, again, it's the same principle, which is exactly what I was saying in response to the previous question. That whatever kind of region, geography, or people that you bring in, it's always the similar logic, really. What about how about thinking about a group of people who don't fight? Let us say a Buddhist kind of government that doesn't kind of want to engage in. So anyway.
Thank you so much.
Right, there was an hand raised by Igor at some point. I don't know if he's still there. Igor Pizzirusso. All right, maybe we can move to the next question. There is a question from the chat. I'm not sure if you're going to have time for more questions, but so this is a question from Matteus. Souvik, do you think that these games are in a way showing the way the colonialism and imperialism are taught in the countries of the developers, since the majority of the games are made in former metropolises?
It's this is a big question now. How is history taught in the countries of the developers? Who are the developers? And you will see. I'm going to take a slightly oblique way to answer this, which is that I have also in my presentation talked about other games, like one game that is made in India called Somewhere, and the other one referred to as Elizabeth Lopenzi's game. So again, there are games that are coming out from other geographies, and those are addressing the issues from very different angles as well. So it's perhaps an idea to look at games from other geographies as well, and luckily now with Steam and games being available, again there are. It's the important thing is to look at other games besides the kind of AAA games that we get from a certain kind of area, really. But then you're absolutely right about kind of how history is taught in schools. But then I wouldn't be able to comment. I've taught in a British school briefly, and I've seen that that there was very little mention of the British Raj, the British Empire in India. But that's just kind of sad. I mean, I've also mentioned how Battlefield 1 just has like a single Indian soldier in a trailer, when the entire, I mean, there are like a 1 million Indian soldiers served on the Western Front and in Turkey. So it's again, or if you watch the movie Dunkirk, I mean, how many Indian soldiers do you see there? So this is again kind of a rewriting of history, which is pretty sad. And I mentioned Dunkirk because it's another medium, but then you get that in many other kind of ways in which history is represented. So yes, yeah. I don't know if I've answered your question, but well, it's a difficult one to comment on.
All right, thank you. We might have time for one final question. I believe Rob would like to ask a question.
Thank you, Paolo. Thank you, Souvik, as well. I'll keep this brief, and I appreciate the suggestions you're making, looking at geographical differences as a way to get around this issue of colonialism. I think part of colonialism, imperialism within games, I wonder how much of this issue ultimately comes down to colonialist and imperialist mechanics are easy to model. So if we go all the way back to chess, to Go, it's about defeating the opponent, it's about taking land. And ultimately, this is where a lot of the strategy games ultimately draw on. So it's all about conquering more territory, defeating your enemies. And while we have games like Crusader Kings, where, well, there's an attempt to move away from constant expansion of territory, most players will inevitably just continue playing like that because that's what they're used to. If we look at other genres, things like Reigns, for example, where you're playing as a ruler, but there's none of this emphasis on expanding your territory. There's none of this emphasis on imperialism. So basically, is it just a matter of moving to possibly a matter of moving to a different genre of game, as well as geography?
I think that's a great question, Rob. And well, I'm really glad that we finally get to meet face to face. I had all these email conversations. So, sorry, am I audible? Can you hear me? So what I think, what I feel is that perhaps video games and games in general give us different mechanics of play. And the algorithmic kind of hard coding of a particular play style, which is preferred, perhaps needn't necessarily always be like that. In a very different context, I did a talk on Snakes and Ladders, which is this common Shoots and Ladders or Snakes and Ladders, this common child's game, which is a race game, which originated in India, actually, not as a race game. It didn't originate, it originated as a game for one person to learn the ways of karma. So the same board might have a different kind of game algorithm coded into it to show a different kind of. So perhaps it's a little more. What I'm asking for is a little more creativity in different kind of, instead of kind of preferring a set kind of model of kind of let's go conquer territory and then yeah, that's what.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay, I think it's best if we stop here. Otherwise, there might not be sufficient time for Esther. Let's say we take a 5 minutes break. Is everyone fine with that? So we'll start 28 past 6 p.m. in Italian time. Is that okay? All right. I'll see you in 5 minutes. Thank you. Thank you very much, Souvik. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. You're still there? Just want to actually take this occasion to show you that I also have the Oregon Trail T-shirt. Only in my case, it's a much more explicit scene from the game. You died of dysentery. In that game, you could actually die of dysentery. So it was very very realistic, and I feel like it's very. I mean, there are not many occasions I can use that T-shirt, to be honest. It's kind of fun.
If you wish to play a very interesting game that is a different perspective, you might want to try this War of Mine by 11-Bit Studio. It's just insane. And I also know the game. Like, we're developers, we have to know strategy and games. And if you have ever played Civilization series, my husband is the creator of Civ 3 and Civ 4. It was actually the first game ever to win a Grammy Award for the music in it. So we are very picky about history and everything we put in our games. So take a look if you have a chance. And I'd love for more conversations to happen, facilitate them between historians, scholars, and developers, because your input to our historical games are, is very important. So let me know if this is an opportunity you're interested in.
Thank you, Laila. Thank you very much. All right, so let's move to the next speaker, Esther Wright, lecturer at Cardiff University. Esther's presentation was on historical digital game promotion, uses and challenges. And so, as we've done with the two previous speakers, I would like Esther to briefly summarize your own work, your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Paolo. Yeah, I'm really happy to have been invited to speak. It's great any chance that I get to speak to other people who are interested in history and games is always appreciated. But yeah, in my presentation, really what I was kind of trying to distill into a very short space of time was kind of the focal point of my work and my research so far, which is really the idea that much of what we need to know, or perhaps should be analyzing about historical digital games, it lies beyond the boundaries of what we kind of conventionally think of as the text. And so I look at historical digital game paratexts rather, as we've already kind of had some initial conversations about so far. And it's something that I now sort of try to encourage my students to think critically about in the sort of my new role as lecturer in digital history at Cardiff. Proof that yes, history departments are recognizing that games and the digital is basically where we need to be going. And I'm very fortunate to be taking advantage of that as far as possible. So by that, really what I'm talking about, and in terms of my own research, is looking at things like the industry and the developers and the way that they are branded and how that kind of influences the way that we are able to make choices about and eventually kind of represent the game, represent history in games, how kind of promotional materials of all kinds sort of are sites for the kind of performance of this role of Adam Chapman's terms of the developer historian, how they kind of are spaces in which developers kind of curate sort of meanings and messages. And, you know, as Andrew was saying, not to get too much into the murky depths of media effects theory, but how they perhaps sort of affect or influence the kind of interpretive possibilities that players might bring with them into actually playing games, if these are the sorts of things they are seeing beforehand. And yeah, the kind of another sort of thing I'm interested in, which is kind of, I guess, run through most of our work, I think, as people who are interested in historical game studies, is these ideas of authenticity and historical authenticity. And certainly it's kind of a hot topical thing that's kind of being talked about a lot at the moment, and how paratexts, as much as the games themselves, can be spaces in which we get the kind of reinterpretation or the sort of propping up, I guess, of broader historical stereotypes and myths, and how essentially by looking at these paratexts we can kind of understand the sort of broader historiographical position that games and the developers are taking, and where they're getting their history from, and how players might be responding to the kind of representation of the past that we see in these games. So yeah, as much as we need sort of more studies of the representation of the past in the games, and more studies of kind of content that also consider the way games work too, so kind of meshing together studies of content and form, we need to be thinking about paratextual content too, is sort of the particular drum that I've been beating for the last few years whenever anyone will let me talk about my work. So yeah, in my new kind of digital history role, I'm also now thinking about what do we do with these sources? How do we kind of tackle these sources? There's a lot of interest at the moment in sort of methodological approaches to thinking about paratexts and incorporating them into our work in historical video games more generally, but also in terms of things like preservation and actually having access to these sorts of materials. Most of them are kind of born digital in the very kind of digital history, digital humanities term of it. And that means that they are particularly fragile in some ways, just being lost. You know, there's no archive of these materials. And this is something that I've been talking to my students a lot about, especially in the last couple of weeks, the idea of doing digital history. How does it change what we think of in terms of the practice of history, but also what we think of as the archive in this supposedly kind of traditional domain of the historian. So yeah, kind of moving forward, I'm thinking methodologically speaking, I'm thinking about kind of things like preservation, exhibition, and how we're going to be studying these sorts of things in the future. So yeah, that's kind of where I am generally speaking.
Thank you, Esther. Thank you very much. All right, we are taking questions from the audience. Yes, Egidio, please.
Hi, everyone. Just to confirm, do you hear me? Okay. So I have a question for Esther, but it can also be applied for the other speakers today. I have to make two premises. First of all, I'm not an historian. I'm a computer engineer with some passion for history in general, and so I studied like almost everyone history through high school. So my knowledge is not academical. So this is what the first premise. Second, I'm a huge fan of the history, strategic games, like Valerio was saying, like Europa Universalis 4. I really liked that game. I spent like 2,000 hours. Yeah. And I have a question that it's not like a question, so it's a thought about how history is received in a game like this. I provide an example. In Europa Universalis 4, you can pick any nation on the world, any. The interesting part is it covered the modern age history from 1444 to 1821. So a lot of changes, secularization, nationalism, and so on. And there is one thing that impressed me, and I'd like to expose to you about the simultaneously of events, of history events, because sometimes I noticed between my high school education that history is often taught like events like they are static. You know, for example, you used to in the history books there is the chapter or Europe, like I don't know, 30 Years War. That then another topic, but Europa Universalis 4 provides a sense of things that are happening through also there are not at the player control. I don't know if you you understand what I'm saying. It's a topic that probably history studies are probably needs to spend some time, because it's an interesting fact about the video game medium, because you can put the player with the events that are surrounding the players, affecting the player action, and also project the action of other things on your decision. Oh, sorry for the premise and for the long question. So, what do you think about this topic?
Help if I would unmute myself first. Yeah, thank you for your sort of question, or posing that kind of topic to me. I guess possibly something that my kind of fellow panelists can speak to equally as much as me, I suppose. I think if I'm kind of interpreting what you're saying correctly, we're talking about the difference between, especially in kind of these kind of grand strategy games that allow, or, you know, are kind of predicated on allowing the player this sort of idea of agency, this idea of creating these kind of counterfactual outcomes, changing the course of history in some way, and really sort of sold on the idea that there are all these kind of multiple moving parts that the player is therefore in control of and making decisions about, and therefore affecting the course of the kind of history that they create. And then I guess on the other side of that is the thing, or rather are the things that are not open to change, the things that will happen kind of regardless of what the player actually chooses or doesn't choose. I suppose, if that's, I think, kind of what you were getting at, maybe, unless I've sort of misunderstood. But I think in those moments where we see the sort of the things that are not open to interpretation by the player, or the things that are not open to change by what the player is doing in the game, is kind of what I see in my own work, what others have argued, I suppose, that this is where we see the kind of, I guess, or one of the areas in which we can talk about the role of the developer as historian, and seeing the kind of the developers' particular sort of historical arguments that they are making about things that are seen to be perhaps just inherent or kind of immovable facts about the past, or about the way that history works. And I guess more generally speaking, this is kind of when I'm sort of teaching my sort of students, my new kind of historical games, digital games module, getting them to kind of therefore expand their definition of what we mean by historical video game, and thinking about all of the kinds of games that sort of offer various kinds of historical interpretations from the kind of the developer's perspective, but also allow the player to kind of get some sort of experience of kind of the process of making history themselves. I don't think that was particularly kind of eloquent response or anything to what you were saying, but hopefully I kind of captured some of it.
Thank you, Esther. We have a number of questions now. Riccardo, and then Francesco. Thank you.
Hi, hello. So thanks for the presentation, Esther. I liked it a lot. It was, you know, fascinating to hear about your work. My question is about the methodology that you hinted at, about the methodology for collecting, preserving, sort of using this very ephemeral, fragile, volatile material. If you could expand a little bit on that, if you developed your own methodology for your own work, or if you sort of blended different methodologies, or what was your process there? It's just a simple, you know, very practical question on how you went about it. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess actually my methodology, as I came to see it, and I still don't really have a kind of clear sense of sort of the methodology or the best way that we should be sort of studying these things, and especially in terms of kind of collecting and preserving, which is something that I, you know, really I have nothing useful to kind of offer on. But the sort of the how and why, what I did myself kind of for my research so far, and particularly sort of my PhD thesis, started with the kind of, I suppose, what felt to me like a very common sense approach in, if I'm going to be writing my entire thesis on games like Red Dead Redemption and LA Noire, what I need to actually be doing is looking at the ways that they are positioned in these kind of very public spaces. So looking at developer websites, looking at sites where we are being told something about these games. So looking at kind of, you know, what used to be much more detailed and richer kind of booklets that came with physical kind of like discs for, you know, for video games. So to me, that seemed kind of really common sense. And it was only sort of when after I had done a lot of the kind of collation of materials, so looking at sort of developer blogs, trailers, various kinds of other promotional materials, it was only after I kind of did this that I realized that this was something actually that's sort of not only understudied, but kind of contentious, not only within game studies, which has been, you know, there have definitely been people who have been doing this work, but it's never kind of come to any sort of, you know, here we are moment. This is our kind of like us looking at Paratech. This is our methods. It was, you know, conversations that were starting to happen more sort of in broader media studies. But again, in a similar vein of, we don't do this enough, you know, looking at kind of the work of people like Jonathan Gray, of Martin Barker, these people who are applying the idea of studying paratext, taking it from Jeanette and kind of literary studies more so. So yeah, it was kind of just the sense that I felt that this was the most reasonable way to be studying a game. I didn't necessarily think that we should be studying any game devoid of the kind of the context that surrounds it and the kind of the broader discourse, and doing these kind of like episodes of discourse analysis to kind of look at how the game is being framed and how you know, what's actually being represented about American history within the games themselves. But then in terms of actually finding these sources, yeah, it's kind of like a sort of weird, slightly haphazard version of digital archaeology, in a way of trying to find things through developer websites when developer websites might change the way they're formatted, and things might move around, things might change where they're positioned or how they're framed when, for example, L.A. Noire gets re-released in 2017, you know, for kind of remastered and re-released, and websites change, promotional materials change. How do we kind of trace something that is not static, even for games that came out sort of 10 years ago? It's a case of laboriously trying to go through websites and find all of the various things that could possibly be relevant and useful, and, you know, trying to do the same for games websites where criticism is happening or developer interviews are happening, games websites that might be shutting down or not, you know, not existing anymore, or things just not being able to find. So at the moment, yeah, it's haphazard. It's not by any means perfect, and it would be specific, I think, to anyone who's doing any kind of this sort of work looking at any particular games. And I'm aware that's not a kind of great methodological answer really to have as a sort of a historian, let alone someone who's studying games, a historian without an archive. But yeah, I guess well, hopefully that sort of starts to answer your question.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
Thank you. Francesco is next. Thank you.
Hi guys, can you hear me? Okay. So I'm part of Ludus group. So thank you, Esther, and thank you to Andrew Elliott and Souvik Mukherjee for the intervention. Me, Lorena, Valerio, and Valerio often discuss about this topic. So I would ask an opinion to Esther, Wright, or also Andrew Elliott about this. Can the video game be used as a source for a historian, side by side, used side by side with the archive fonts, primary source, not fonts in Italiano. So can the video game be used as a source side by side with the archive documents to analyze an historical event? And the other end, in order to study a single video game, like Esther with the Red Dead Redemption, I guess, what kind of source we have to use? Thank you.
I guess to take the kind of first part of that, can a game be used as a source? I think the broad answer would be yes, but I suppose the secondary answer is what kind of source are we using it as? For me, on the one hand, looking at the way that certain periods or certain events or people are represented in games, you know, it is the sort of thing I imagine that people will be studying in however many decades time, to look at the way that, you know, we perceived certain historical periods at our contemporary moment in the same way that people have used film to do so, to look at how or not film was particularly shaped by the context in which it was created. But yeah, I think the value, as I see it, and I think as other people do see it, of digital historical games that are representing a particular period is this kind of historiographical intervention, perhaps, that they are making. And interestingly, how that's kind of, you know, intentional or not, whether people, you know, the sort of the people who are creating or marketing these games, you know, maybe they don't sit down and realize, or, you know, intend to kind of write this sort of historiographical statement when making a game, but through looking at the way that they are being sold, through looking at the kinds of things that are chosen to be incorporated, through looking at the sorts of things that are available to players to do, they do serve as a kind of source that gives us a kind of state of what, historiographically speaking, point of knowledge we are at, what is the most pervasive understanding of a certain period, and how do games then try to capture that. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the second part of your question after that. Oh wait, what sources need to be studied alongside games? Is that what you're
Yes, if you, for example, I want to analyze one single video game, what kind of source I have to use?
Well, in terms of, I think, do you mean in terms of like kind of what I was doing in terms of paratext and stuff? The things, if we're thinking of the things around the kind of game, it can really be anything kind of specific to general. So in terms of looking at paratext, in terms of the stuff that I did, it was sort of developer websites, it was developer blogs, looking at trailers, looking at social media, looking at developer interviews, physical packaging. But we, you know, and my focus in particular was specifically on the sort of developer angle of it, or the industrial angle of it. I haven't perhaps looked at players and what players actually do with it as much as I could have. But for that, we can be looking at anything from, you know, social media, from forums, from let's play videos, the way that kind of the way that players engage with and play with the past through games is sort of performed in these online spaces. And this is only, you know, to talk of digital spaces and digital games. But the other kind of sources that, you know, we can look at alongside games, I guess, to get a perhaps broader sense of context too, is looking at specific games about specific periods in concert with other forms of popular culture. And to kind of come back to the discussion, particularly during Andrew's presentation we were having earlier about, you know, games as distinct from, and coming back to the point that Marco was making, games are supposedly distinct from historical film and historical TV. Well, I don't think that's the case. I think, yes, this is something that at certain points in time, game studies has decided they wanted to prove that it was somehow distinct, but there's no point looking at digital historical games as somehow siloed off from broader kinds of popular culture, from historical films and historical TV shows, because you can trace these kind of particular lineages or perhaps historiographical perspectives through the kinds of representations of the past we get in the sort of popular culture the games draw. I was just kind of fortunate in the sense of the sources that I was looking at. The people who were marketing it at Rockstar were kind of telling the player the sort of sources that they were looking at in terms of historical films and wider popular culture about the Western or about noir. So it was kind of straightforward for me in sort of tracing a kind of particular lineage of where certain ideas about particular periods in American history were coming from. So yeah, the possibilities are endless, dare I say.
All right, thank you, Esther. So we have a question from Andra Ivanescu.
Oh yeah, hello. Actually, that follows on quite well from what you were saying, because mine is a question of genre. And it feels like genre has come up a lot today. And, you know, Andrew mentioned affordances of genre. Can't really talk about colonialism in strategy games without looking at sort of strategy games more broadly and their affordances, and of course their histories if you go back to the Kriegspiel and so on and so forth. And the games that you chose there, obviously Red Dead and LA Noire, are, like you said, you know, fully embedded in Western and film noir genres respectively. And I have to admit, I have some skin in the game here as well. Like Marco, I've also written about LA Noire, and I've actually dug through a lot of the paratextual material that you mentioned. And I found it quite interesting how sometimes there seems to be an interplay between what the bits in the paratext and what Rockstar put forth that are supposed to be historically accurate and the bits that are supposed to be inspired by genre, even though in practice, like some of the things they were talking about were sort of like, this is historically accurate. We looked at all of these props from the 1940s films that tell us something about the era. So my question was basically this, like, how do you see this sort of interplay between genre and history, and this sort of foundational view of history through the lens of genre in this paratext?
To be honest, unavoidable, I guess. Something that, you know, what point would there be making a game like making LA Noire or making a sort of Red Dead Redemption if you weren't going to sort of consciously look into or repeat, speak to those genres well, I say that in terms of a kind of AAA game. So yeah, I similarly kind of find the sort of things that you're talking about really interesting. This is where these ideas about historical authenticity, perhaps as opposed to historical accuracy, kind of come out to play. In that you have games like games like LA Noire that there was a lot of kind of press discourse and critical discourse around at the time when it sort of originally came out and was developed about how much, how specifically and how accurately and faithfully it had reconstructed the city of Los Angeles as it was in 1947, and people asking, we should be allowing students to kind of like play this game in a sort of weird precursor to like Assassin's Creed Discovery Tour or something. But at the same time, then, and certainly the sort of the way that games like Red Dead and Red Dead 2 are kind of marketed in terms of the very, very specific levels of detail that are accurate, and a kind of real fetishizing of particular pieces of material culture and the way things looked. But similarly, how can you separate the way that Red Dead looks from something like Westworld, especially when like the TV show has just come out, or from the kind of iconographies that have been established over over 100 years. So yeah, I still don't really kind of, for me, it's the interplay between genre and genres, reworkings of history and historical periods is something that we can't untangle at this point, or rather it's very difficult to untangle at this point, and perhaps we don't need to untangle at this point necessarily, because this is the way that so many people interpret and understand these particular periods anyway, if that sort of answers what you're saying.
Thank you. I might have a question actually, which is kind of following up from some of the things you were mentioning. So while I was listening to your presentation, Esther, I was thinking about what are your thoughts about the political uses of historical accuracy, particularly in game culture? And your presentation made me think of the game Kingdom Come by Daniel Vavra, which it is not a game that I have played, I admit, but it's a game that I've learned about through the work of some of my students, which apparently started this huge controversy in relation to the representation of Bohemia in the 15th century. And according to the lead designer, the representation was as historically accurate as possible. And this historical accuracy was essentially making the bodies of women, for instance, disappearing from from the game. So it was essentially the 15th century Bohemia was a sort of male fantasy with men going around doing adventures and with no women around. And so that game became at some point a sort of a symbol, if you like, of also the Gamergate controversy, of a sort of reappropriation, if you like, from the side of the male gamers of this entertainment tool. Everything was done for the sake of historical accuracy, or sort of justifying that representation through this idea. So I don't know, what are your thoughts about that?
Many, really. It's interesting because next week in my sort of module that I'm teaching at Cardiff, we're talking about the sort of similar, I guess, well, similar in some ways, backlash again around the release of the trailer for Battlefield 5 or Battlefield B when it came out, about the inclusion of a female combatant on the sort of front lines in the Second World War. And, this sort of hashtag not my battlefield and how unrealistic supposedly it was, is a kind of symptom or another example of, as you say, this sort of the kind of discourse, I guess, around Kingdom Come when it came out. And I suppose the question is really coming back to the conversation that was happening earlier, this idea of like, well, whose history? Who gets to decide what is or isn't accurate? Its accuracy is this, as troublesome a term as any of the other ones we might use, like authenticity, perhaps. And, it's kind of, whenever I sort of think about these sorts of things, or whenever I talk about these sorts of things, I kind of come back to Adrian Shaw's article, which talks about the tyranny of realism and the idea that demanding from a developer perspective or from a player perspective, the supposed demands for realism and what is believable and seems realistic in relation to the way that a certain period or event is represented shuts down the possibility of imagining history otherwise, and imagining and including other historical narratives or historical, rather people and stories that have for so long been kind of shut out of mainstream games because we just don't know them as part of our kind of dominant historiographical narratives. This doesn't mean they're any less real or any less accurate than the kind of narratives that get repeated over and over again. But just because they're not familiar to us doesn't mean that they never happened. And it's about, I suppose, people can demand accuracy as much as they want, but, there's always the kind of other question of, well, who gets to say what's accurate? Because it's the kind of fatal fallacy of everything we do as historians, or everything that historians do, is that it will always, whatever history we create or historical narrative we create, will always be at kind of the mercy of our own interpretation and kind of selection. So when somebody kind of selectively decides to make a game that doesn't include any women, or because of course they could never have had anything worthy of contributing to the past because of where they were particularly positioned at that time, and it wasn't definitely in these stories that we think are valuable, worth telling or worth playing, that is a political choice and will always unavoidably be so.
All right, thank you. There is a question from Souvik in the chat, and we might have to finish with that question, but we can leave the microphones open and continue the chat afterwards. We can, if you have time. So Souvik is asking a question to Esther. Have you looked at how after-action reports affect the representation of history and historiography in video games? This will also connect to what modding does in the fringes of history.
Yeah, thank you for that question. The short answer to that is that I haven't. Just for kind of the sake of scope and my own headspace, I sort of decided that I'm not looking at players. Not that I don't think that's something that we need to be doing, obviously, but yeah, it's not something that I looked at. But equally kind of a worthy way of understanding exactly sort of how players are kind of receiving these games, like thinking about exactly how they are negotiating the kind of representation of the past that games are giving. in terms of deciding whether or not they think that they are accurate or authentic or whatever sort of word we're gonna use for it. So yeah, I'm sorry that's not more of an answer. It's a kind of area I'm aware that I haven't been looking at and probably need to. But yeah, I'll have a look at the sort of the link that you suggested. That's really interesting. So thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Esther. It's 6 p.m. in the UK, 7 p.m. in Italy. So officially, we should be finishing by now. Apologies for all those of you who've been writing some other questions and we had to cut them short. But I would like to propose, as we are now closing the symposium, that if you have time and if you like, I can leave the Zoom video call open, and you can turn the mics off and have a informal conversation, or just follow up on some of the debates that were started during this event. So I would like to thank everyone, thank the speakers, Esther, Wright, Andrew Elliott, Souvik, Mukherjee, for your participation, for your talks, for the fantastic debate that we have been having today, and to all the participants for your questions, all your the chat. Also, there were some very interesting conversations going on in the chat as well. Just a few things. I will try to copy the chat and send a copy of that to the speakers. So if there are some questions or things that have been we couldn't pick up in the conversation, that they should have a record of that. Also, I will stop the recording now, but again, if for whatever reason you will prefer the recording not to be shared or not to be circulated, please let me know by email. I will be, feel free to get in touch about that. We will be back tomorrow at the same time. Marco will be moderating the symposium tomorrow. We have Stefano Caselli from University of Malta, Robert Houghton from the University of Winchester, and Lorena Rao, independent researcher, who will be answering your questions about their talks. So thank you, everyone, and I'll see you tomorrow, or if you have time to stay, I'll be happy to spend some time and continue the conversation. Thanks.